We are already tracking events from our Xamarin Forms application. Now let's wrap up this section by adding those properties that we can add to all of these events so we have more context about where these events are happening. So I'm going to navigate back to Visual Studio and I'm going to modify my track event method. It is now, of course, going to be requesting a dictionary of strings, string for both the key and the value. This is also going to be called properties. And this is going to be by default null. So the properties parameter is still optional. If I call the track event without it, it's okay because properties is going to be null by default. So I'm going to pass properties over here to the track event as well, which, as we saw, is very similar to the track error method. It also receives that dictionary for the properties. So now I want to change how some of these methods are being tracked. For example, when we save the book, we may want to pass some information about the book that is being saved. So I'm going to be initializing some dictionary in here. So I will create a new dictionary that is called, key value pairs. And this is going to be containing some properties, just as we did when we started sending some properties to track the errors. So let's say that this is going to be some information about the book. I can pass a book info property that is going to, simply use the current book and turn it into a string. And we could even, of course, override the toString method to send this as the type of string that we want. So I'm going to be doing that. I will override the toString method, and this is now going to be returning some different string. So maybe the string is going to contain the name of the book, dash, and the author of the book. So whenever the toString method for the book is called, which is going to be happening over here, it is going to return a string with the name and the author. We could, of course, add more information in here, but that is going to be sent directly. And by the way, I don't need this keyword. I can just call toString since I am inside of this class. And let's say that we're also going to be passing some information about the network. And the network is either going to be cellular, or maybe in some scenarios it is going to be Wi-Fi. I don't know, some information like this. And eventually I will just pass this information over to the track events method. So pass the key value pairs. And something very similar I am going to be doing with this event that I'm tracking here when the person is logged in. So I am actually going to be copying this code when I create the key value pairs and paste it over here. This eventually is also going to be passed to the track event. So let's pass it already, the key value pairs. I'm just going to be changing what is being passed as the properties. Let's say that I want the user that is being logged in here. And I'm going to pass some, of course, default information, something like this. And maybe also the network. Let's say that in this case, for some reason, it is going to be Wi-Fi. So I'm going to be tracking these events now with some properties. Notice that the events that exist in the main page that are being tracked in the main page still do not contain the properties. That is entirely fine because, as we saw, our track event method is already assigning a default value to this dictionary. So by default, even if we don't pass anything, that is already taken care of. So let's run this one more time. I want to make the event for when a book is saved and for when a user logs in to be executed again, to be tracked again. So I will navigate over to the login page and click login. This should have already tracked this event over here in the login page, the logged in event. And it should now have some key value pairs, some properties attached to that event. And if I navigate now to the new book page and click on the save button, it should also now be tracking that book saved event with some properties. These two properties that I added in here. And by the way, of course, you could add n amount of properties in here. Any property that you may want to track, you can add it in here. This is after all a dictionary. There's no real limit to how many properties you can add in here. All of them are eventually going to be displayed over an App Center. So now we have tracked two events. Now let me navigate over to App Center, navigate back to events and see that indeed some of them have already been tracked. I now see, for example, that the ad book intent has been executed 7 times, the other ones 2 times. So if we navigate over to the ad book intent, we will of course see no properties because this particular event is never tracking any property. If we navigate to Visual Studio, we can make sure of that. We can double check on the main page that the ad book intent is never sent with any properties. Neither is the login intent. But if we navigate over to, for example, the book saved or the logged in events, these do have some properties being attached to them. So if I select either of these and navigate down, I will see those properties, the book info and the network. And in this case, of course, the book that I'm saving always is empty. If I navigate over to the new book page, I am creating the book with the author empty and the name empty, so that's why it looks just like a dash, because when the toString method for the book is being called, well, name is empty, author is empty, so only the dash is added, and probably this is spaces. But it is more noticeable in the network that indeed it is using cellular. And if I navigate over to logged in, I see the non-existent, by the way, email that I added in here, and that the network is Wi-Fi. And you can imagine how having this information can be useful. You may be able to notice that most of your users use Wi-Fi, or most of them use cellular. Because of course you would see a list in here of all of the values that the network property has had. So in this case, I am hard coding Wi-Fi, but in a real world scenario, you may want to actually check what network is being used. And in here you may see a list of users, how many times a certain user is logging in. In this scenario, of course, only one value for each property is being listed, and that particular value has happened 100% of the times. But as we execute this application more and more with more different values to each of the properties, you will see this change. So there you have it. This is how you can start tracking all of these values for the properties. And if you navigate, by the way, over to overview, you can still see that information is still being tracked as we saw from the beginning. Except that now, since we are tracking some events, and those events are even having some properties attached to them, we see a bit more information, for example, about the session duration. So during this section, we have learned how to use this part of App Center, the diagnostics and the analytics, which is going to help you and your team identify exactly what may be going on with your application, especially here on diagnostics, which can be the beginning of creating a new feature or solving a certain bug, which we have talked about, of course, eventually is going to make you build a new version of your application, test it, and distribute it, which is exactly what we're going to start to do in the next section. We're going to start with the continuous integration part of App Center, which simply refers to this Build tab. We're going to be connecting our repository, and we're going to see how by simply sending all of this code that we have locally over to our repository is going to trigger a continuous integration process. So far you may not be tracking all of these changes over on Git, but starting in the next section, it is going to be very important to do so. And we're going to see exactly how is it that GitHub will come into play by integrating into App Center.